The sun blazed mercilessly over the Arizona desert as Marcus Riley pulled his worn hat lower over his weathered face. Dust clouds swirled around his horse's hooves, creating small tornadoes that danced across the barren landscape. At 32, Marcus had spent half his life riding these unforgiving trails, but today felt different. Today, something in the air whispered of change, of destiny waiting just beyond the next ridge. His cattle ranch had been struggling for months. The drought had claimed most of his livestock, and the bank notices tucked in his saddlebag served as constant reminders of his mounting debts. Marcus had come out here not just to check his remaining cattle, but to think, to figure out how to save the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. The Apache reservation bordered his property to the east, and relations had always been tense but respectful. Marcus's father had taught him to honor the indigenous people who had called this land home long before any white settlers arrived. Unlike many of his neighbors, Marcus had never participated in the raids or conflicts that occasionally flared between the communities. As he crested a small hill, Marcus noticed smoke rising from a valley below. Not the thick, black smoke of a wildfire, but the thin, controlled smoke of a campfire. Curious and slightly concerned, he guided his horse down the rocky slope, careful not to make too much noise. What he saw when he reached the valley floor made his blood run cold. 3 white men, rough-looking traders by their appearance, had set up a temporary camp. But they weren't alone. Near their fire sat 2 young Apache women, their hands bound, fear evident in their dark eyes. Marcus recognized them immediately. They were from the nearby reservation, probably gathering medicinal herbs when these men had found them. The traders were laughing among themselves, passing around a bottle of whiskey and discussing their plans in crude terms. Marcus's jaw clenched as he heard fragments of their conversation. They intended to sell the women to brothels in the nearest mining town, treating them like property rather than human beings. Marcus had always prided himself on being a peaceful man, but seeing the terror in the young women's eyes ignited something fierce within him. He thought of his own sister, who had died young from fever, and how he would have wanted someone to protect her if she had been in danger. Slowly, Marcus dismounted and checked his rifle. He had 6 bullets and faced 3 armed men. The odds weren't favorable, but he couldn't ride away knowing what would happen to those women. His father's voice echoed in his memory, "Sometimes, son, doing what's right means risking everything you have." He studied the camp layout carefully. The traders had grown careless with their whiskey, their weapons leaning against rocks rather than kept close at hand. The 2 women sat near a large boulder that could provide cover. If Marcus moved quickly and quietly, he might be able to even the odds. Taking a deep breath, Marcus began his approach. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. The desert had taught him patience and stealth during his years of hunting. Now those skills would serve a different purpose entirely. The first trader never saw him coming. Marcus struck him with the butt of his rifle, dropping the man silently into unconsciousness. The second trader looked up from the fire just as Marcus's boot connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling backward into the flames. The man's screams alerted the third trader, who scrambled for his gun. "Don't move!" Marcus barked, his rifle trained on the remaining man. "Not unless you want to join your friends in whatever comes next." The trader, a wiry man with cruel eyes, slowly raised his hands. "Easy there, cowboy. We ain't done nothing wrong. These Apache girls, they're fair game. Everyone knows that." "Everyone's wrong," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "They're human beings, not property to be bought and sold." He moved toward the women while keeping his rifle pointed at the trader. Using his knife, he carefully cut their bonds, speaking softly in the few Apache words he had learned over the years. "You're safe now," he said, hoping they understood his tone if not his words. The older of the 2 women, perhaps 20 years old, looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. She had heard stories of white men who rescued Apache women only to claim them for themselves. But something in Marcus's eyes, a genuine kindness and respect, told her this man was different. "We must go quickly," she said in accented English, surprising Marcus. "More men come." They wait at canyon mouth. Marcus's heart sank. This wasn't just a random encounter with 3 opportunistic traders. This was part of a larger operation, possibly involving dozens of men. The women weren't just victims of circumstance, they had been specifically targeted and hunted.
How many men?
Marcus asked, already calculating their chances of escape.
Maybe 10, maybe more, the woman replied.
They have guns, horses.
We run on foot, they catch us easy.
The traitor Marcus held at gunpoint began to laugh.
You hear that, hero? You just walked into a hornet's nest.
Boys will be here before sunset, and, when they find out what you done. He made a slashing motion across his throat. Marcus looked at the two women, then, at his horse. His mount was strong but couldn't carry 3 people very far, especially across rough terrain. The nearest settlement was 2 days' ride, and the Apache reservation was even farther. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast.
What are your names?
Marcus asked the women, keeping his rifle steady on the traitor.
I am Ayana, the older woman said.
This is my sister, Takala. We thank you for helping us, but you should go.
Save yourself. We understand, this is not your fight.
Marcus shook his head. It became my fight the moment I saw what these men were doing to you.
I'm not leaving you here to face them alone.
The younger sister, Takala, spoke rapidly in Apache to Ayana, who translated, she says you are brave but foolish. The men who come, they are led by a man called Snake Wilson. He is very dangerous, kills for pleasure. Even other white men fear him. Marcus had heard of Snake Wilson, a ruthless traitor who dealt in everything from stolen cattle to human trafficking.
The man's reputation for violence was legendary across the territory.
Knowing who they faced made their situation even more desperate, but it also strengthened Marcus's resolve. If Wilson was involved, then this operation was larger and more organized than he had initially thought. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red. Soon it would be dark, which could work either for them or against them, depending on how well Wilson's men knew the terrain.
Is there anywhere we can hide? Marcus asked. Somewhere they wouldn't think to look? Ayana considered this carefully.
There is a place, she said slowly.
Sacred place, hidden in rocks.
But... She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the idea.
But, what? It is forbidden for outsiders to enter. Our people would be very angry if they knew.
Marcus understood the weight of what she was suggesting. Sacred sites were not just religious locations for the Apache, they were integral to their spiritual and cultural identity. For her to even consider bringing him there showed how desperate their situation had become. I understand the significance, Marcus said carefully. I give you my word that I'll treat the place with the utmost respect.
But, if it's our only chance.
The traitor, who had been listening to their conversation with growing amusement, spoke up again.
You think some old Apache hiding place is going to save you?
Snake knows every inch of this desert. He'll find you wherever you go, and, when he does. The man's grin was filled with malice. Marcus struck the traitor with his rifle but, finally, silencing him. He then used rope from the man's own supplies to tie him securely to a large rock. When your friends arrive, you can tell them exactly what happened here, Marcus said. And, you can tell them that if they want these women, they'll have to go through me first. As they prepared to leave, Marcus gathered what supplies he could from the traitor's camp. Water was the most precious commodity in the desert, and he filled every container he could find.
He also took ammunition and some dried food, though he left the whiskey behind.
They would need clear heads for what lay ahead. Ayana led them away from the camp, moving with the fluid grace of someone who had grown up in this harsh landscape. She seemed to know exactly where every rock and crevice lay, navigating by landmarks that were invisible to Marcus's untrained eye. As they walked, Takala stayed close to her sister, occasionally glancing back at Marcus with curiosity. Despite their ordeal, she seemed remarkably resilient, and Marcus found himself admiring the strength both women displayed. The sacred place Ayana had mentioned was further than Marcus had hoped. They traveled for over an hour, climbing steadily into a maze of red rock formations that jutted from the desert floor like ancient monuments.
The path was treacherous, requiring careful footwork to avoid loose stones that could trigger a dangerous slide. Finally, Ayana stopped before what appeared to be a solid rock wall. But, as Marcus looked closer, he could see that shadows played tricks here, hiding a narrow opening that was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways.
"This is the entrance," Ayana said solemnly. "Beyond is a chamber where our ancestors came to speak with spirits. The rock paintings inside are older than memory, older than the oldest stories our grandmothers tell." Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was about to enter a place that had been sacred to these people for countless generations, a place where their ancestors had sought guidance and communion with the divine. The trust Ayana was placing in him was extraordinary. "I understand," he said quietly. "I won't forget the honor you're showing me." They squeezed through the opening one by one, with Marcus bringing up the rear. Inside, the chamber opened up into a surprisingly large space, lit by shafts of fading sunlight that filtered down through cracks in the ceiling above. The walls were indeed covered with ancient paintings, figures of animals, hunters, and spiritual symbols that seemed to dance in the shifting light. But what struck Marcus most was the sense of peace that permeated the place. Despite everything they had been through, despite the danger that was undoubtedly pursuing them, he felt a calmness here that he had never experienced before. It was as if the chamber itself offered sanctuary not just from physical threats, but from the chaos and violence of the outside world. Ayana moved to a particular spot on the far wall where the rock paintings seemed most concentrated. She knelt and began speaking softly in Apache, her words flowing like a prayer or meditation. Takala joined her, and together they performed what Marcus assumed was some kind of ritual acknowledgement of the sacred space. When they finished, Ayana turned to Marcus. "I have asked the spirits to forgive us for bringing you here," she said. "And I have asked them to protect us all from the evil that follows." Marcus nodded respectfully. "I hope they'll accept my presence. I mean no disrespect to your people or your traditions." As darkness began to fall outside, they settled in to wait. Marcus positioned himself near the entrance where he could watch for any signs of pursuit while the women rested deeper in the chamber. The events of the day weighed heavily on his mind, and he found himself questioning every decision that had led to this moment. He could have ridden away when he first saw the traders' camp. He could have reported what he saw to the authorities, though he knew from experience that law enforcement in this territory was often more concerned with protecting white settlers than Apache rights. He could have found a dozen reasons to justify not getting involved. But, looking at Ayana and Takala, seeing the gratitude in their eyes despite their exhaustion and fear, Marcus knew he had made the right choice. These were innocent people who had been targeted simply because of their race and perceived vulnerability. If he had ridden away, he would have been complicit in their suffering. The sound of distant hoofbeats echoed across the desert, growing gradually louder. Snake Wilson and his men had arrived at the camp and discovered their unconscious comrades and missing prisoners. Marcus could imagine the fury that discovery would have triggered. Through the narrow opening of the chamber, Marcus could see torchlights moving across the landscape like deadly fireflies. Wilson's men were beginning their search, and it would only be a matter of time before they expanded their efforts to include the rock formations where they now hid. Ayana appeared beside him, moving with the silent grace that seemed natural to her people. "They will search all night," she whispered. "But they do not know this place. The entrance is hidden well. What happens if they find us?" Marcus asked. Ayana's expression was grim. "Snake Wilson does not leave witnesses. He will kill you quickly if you are lucky." "Us?" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus checked his rifle again, counting his remaining ammunition. 6 bullets against what might be a dozen or more armed men. The mathematics of survival were not encouraging. But numbers weren't everything. They had the advantage of position, and, more importantly, they had something worth fighting for. The night stretched on with agonizing slowness. Several times, search parties passed close enough to the hidden chamber that Marcus could hear their voices clearly. The men were frustrated, angry, and increasingly desperate to find their missing quarry. Their language was coarse and filled with threats about what they would do when they found the Apache squaws and whoever was fool enough to help them. Around midnight, the search parties seemed to move farther away, but Marcus knew better than to let his guard down. Snake Wilson had a reputation for being cunning as well as ruthless. The apparent withdrawal might be genuine, or it might be a trap designed to lure them into revealing their position. As the hours passed, Marcus found himself in quiet conversation with Ayanna. She told him about her family, about the struggles her people face trying to maintain their traditional way of life while adapting to an increasingly hostile world dominated by white settlers. She spoke of her grandmother, who remembered the time before the reservations, when the Apache roamed freely across vast territories that were now divided by fences and borders. In return, Marcus shared his own story. He talked about his ranch, about his father's dreams of building something lasting on this harsh but beautiful land. He spoke of his struggles to keep the family property afloat, and his growing realization that the old ways of thinking about land ownership and racial relations needed to change. "Your father," Ayanna said thoughtfully, "he sounds like a good man." Not many white ranchers teach their sons to respect Apache people. "He believed that this land was big enough for everyone," Marcus replied. "He said that fighting over it just made everyone poorer and more miserable." "I'm starting to understand what he meant." Takala, who had been listening quietly to their conversation, suddenly spoke up in English for the first time since the rescue. "You risk much for strangers," she said, her accent heavier than her sister's but her meaning clear. "Why?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "Because you're not strangers, you're my neighbors. Because if we don't help each other, who will?" The young woman studied his face in the dim light filtering through the chamber, as if trying to read the truth in his features. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded slowly and returned to her quiet vigilance. As dawn approached, the sounds from outside grew quieter. The search parties had apparently moved on, at least temporarily. But Marcus knew that Snake Wilson wouldn't give up easily. The man's reputation had been built on his persistence as much as his cruelty. "We can't stay here forever," Marcus said to Ayanna. "Eventually, they'll either find us or figure out that we've moved on. Either way, we need a better plan than just hiding." Ayanna nodded. "There is a trading post 2 days right north. The owner, Murphy, he is fair man. He trades with Apache people, treats us with respect. If we could reach there. 2 days through open desert," Marcus mused. "With them hunting us every step of the way." "There is another path," Takala said quietly. "Through the old canyon system. Longer, but more hidden. Our people used it in the old days when soldiers came." Marcus looked at both women, seeing the hope and determination in their eyes. They were proposing to trust him not just with their lives, but with knowledge of secret routes that their people had used for generations to escape persecution. The responsibility was overwhelming. "If we're going to do this," he said finally, "we do it together. All the way to safety, whatever that takes." As the first rays of sunlight began to penetrate the sacred chamber, illuminating the ancient rock paintings in warm golden hues, Marcus felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about rescuing 2 Apache women anymore. This was about proving that different peoples could work together, could trust each other, could find common ground even in the most desperate circumstances. The marks on the cave walls seemed to watch over them as they prepared to leave, ancient eyes that had witnessed countless struggles and triumphs over the centuries. Marcus said a silent prayer to whatever spirits inhabited this place, asking for guidance and protection for the dangerous journey ahead. They would leave at sunset, when the desert heat had subsided and darkness would provide cover. Until then, they would rest, plan, and prepare for what might be their only chance at freedom. The cowboy, the tracker's daughter, and her sister, an unlikely alliance forged in desperation but strengthened by growing mutual respect and determination. Outside, the desert waited with its harsh beauty and hidden dangers. But, inside the sacred chamber, 3 people from different worlds had found something precious and rare, the beginning of understanding, trust, and hope for a future where such cooperation might be possible on a larger scale. The ancient spirits seemed to approve, their painted forms dancing in the morning light as if blessing the alliance that had been formed in their sacred space. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The desert evening painted the sky in brilliant shades of purple and gold as Marcus, Ayana, and Takala prepared to leave their sanctuary. They had spent the day resting and planning their route through the canyon system that Takala had described. The hidden passages would add at least a full day to their journey, but they offered the best chance of avoiding Snake Wilson's search parties. Marcus had redistributed their limited supplies, keeping only the essentials: water, ammunition, a small amount of dried food, and his father's compass.
Every ounce mattered when traveling on foot through unforgiving terrain.
His horse would have to be left behind, the narrow canyon paths were too dangerous for a large animal, and the sound of hoofbeats would carry too far in the still desert air. As they squeezed back through the chamber's hidden entrance, Ayana paused to perform another brief ritual, speaking words of gratitude to the spirits who had sheltered them. Marcus watched respectfully, increasingly aware of the depth of trust these women were placing in him. They were sharing not just their knowledge of secret paths, but their spiritual traditions as well.
The first few hours of travel went smoothly.
Takala led them along paths that seemed invisible to Marcus's eyes, following routes that had been used by her people for generations. The young woman moved with an almost supernatural awareness of the landscape, reading signs in rock formations and plant growth patterns that told stories of water sources, safe passage, and potential dangers.
"How do you know all this?"
Marcus whispered during a brief rest stop. They were perched on a narrow ledge halfway down a canyon wall, the path ahead disappearing around a bend into darkness.
"My grandfather was a scout," Takala replied, her English improving with practice.
"Before the reservations, before the soldiers came in great numbers. He taught me to read the land as white men read books. Every rock, every plant, every shadow has meaning."
Ayana added,
"Our grandfather said the land remembers everything, every step taken, every drop of blood spilled, every prayer offered.
Those who learn to listen can hear its voice."
Marcus found himself thinking about his own relationship with the land. As a rancher, he had always seen it in terms of productivity, how many cattle it could support, how much water the springs provided, how the grass grew after rain. But, listening to the sisters, he began to understand a different perspective, one that saw the land as a living entity with its own wisdom and memory. They resumed their journey as the moon reached its zenith, providing just enough light to navigate the treacherous canyon paths. The route Takala had chosen led them through a maze of narrow passages and hidden chambers, some so tight they had to turn sideways to squeeze through. At times, they climbed using handholds carved into the rock walls by ancient peoples, following routes that predated recorded history. Around midnight, they heard it, the distant sound of horses moving along the canyon rim high above them. Snake Wilson's men were still searching, and they were getting closer. Marcus motioned for silence, and all three pressed themselves against the canyon wall, becoming one with the shadows. The sounds grew louder, accompanied by voices echoing down from the rim. Marcus couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was clear: frustration and anger. The searchers were growing impatient, and impatient men made dangerous decisions.
"They're following the main canyon," Ayana whispered barely audibly.
"But there are side passages.
If they split up."
She didn't need to finish the thought. If Wilson's men began exploring the side canyons systematically, it would only be a matter of time before they found the hidden route. Their head start was evaporating with each passing hour.
Takala made a decision.
She pointed to a nearly invisible crack in the canyon wall and began climbing. The passage was so narrow that Marcus wasn't sure they could fit through it, but the young Apache woman moved with confident determination. Ayana followed, and Marcus brought up the rear, his larger frame making the tight spaces even more challenging. The crack led to a series of connected chambers and passages that wound deep into the rock formation. Some were natural caves carved by water over millions of years, while others showed signs of human modification, walls smoothed by countless hands, steps carved into steep inclines, and occasional rock paintings that seemed to glow in the moonlight. "This is the heart path," Takala explained softly once they had traveled far enough from the entrance to speak safely.
"Only the wisest elders knew of it. My grandfather made me promise never to reveal it unless lives depended on it."
Marcus felt the weight of that promise, understanding that by bringing him here, Takala was breaking a solemn oath to protect her people's most closely guarded secrets. "I'll never speak of this place to anyone," he promised. "You have my word." They traveled through the heart path for what felt like hours, though time became meaningless in the eternal darkness of the underground passages. Marcus's respect for the ancient peoples who had carved these routes grew with each step. The precision of the construction, the way the passages connected to form a complex network, spoke of engineering skills and geographic knowledge that rivaled anything he had seen in modern construction. Eventually, they began climbing again, following a passage that led steadily upward toward what Marcus hoped would be an exit. The air grew fresher, carrying scents of sage and desert flowers that suggested they were approaching the surface. They emerged through another concealed opening, this one hidden behind a curtain of hanging vegetation that grew from a natural spring. The water was crystal clear and cold, a precious oasis in the harsh desert landscape. All three drank gratefully, refilling their water containers while maintaining careful watch for any signs of pursuit. "Where are we?" Marcus asked, looking around at the unfamiliar landscape. The canyon system had disoriented him completely. "One day's walk from Murphy's trading post," Ayana replied. "But the path from here is open ground. No more hidden passages." The coming dawn would leave them exposed as they crossed the final stretch to safety. Marcus studied the terrain ahead, noting several low ridges that might provide cover, but also recognizing that the open areas between them would make them vulnerable to anyone with a good rifle and a steady aim. As if summoned by his thoughts, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the desert. Not from behind them, but from ahead, directly between their position and Murphy's trading post. Snake Wilson had anticipated their destination and positioned his men accordingly. "How many?" Takala whispered, her eyes fixed on the distant dust clouds that marked the searchers' positions. Marcus counted at least 6 separate groups, spread across their intended route like a net designed to catch them no matter which direction they chose. Wilson was proving himself to be a more formidable opponent than Marcus had hoped. "We can't go forward," he said grimly. "And we can't go back. They'll have people watching the canyon entrance by now." Ayana studied the landscape with the same intensity her sister had shown when navigating the hidden passages. "There is another way," she said slowly. "But it is very dangerous. More dangerous than anything we have done so far." "What kind of dangerous?" Marcus asked. "Devil's Spine," Takala said, her voice filled with dread. "The ridge that crosses the valley like a broken backbone. Our people call it the place where the earth bleeds." Marcus had heard stories about Devil's Spine from other ranchers and travelers. It was a narrow, knife-edge ridge of rock that stretched for nearly a mile across a deep valley. The path along its crest was barely wide enough for a single person, with deadly drops on both sides. Wind and weather had made it even more treacherous over the years, and several people had fallen to their deaths attempting to cross it. "The stories say it cannot be crossed," Ayana continued. "But my grandfather claimed he did it once, long ago, when soldiers pursued him. He said there are handholds carved into the rock, hidden from view unless you know exactly where to look." Marcus weighed their options. Crossing Devil's Spine would be incredibly risky, but it might be their only chance. Wilson's men would never expect them to attempt such a dangerous route, and even if they did, few would be willing to follow. "If your grandfather crossed it once, then it can be done again," Marcus said with more confidence than he felt. "How do we get there?" The sisters led him away from the spring and across a series of low hills that gradually rose toward the infamous ridge. As they climbed higher, Marcus could see the full extent of Wilson's search net spread across the valley below. The man had deployed his forces with military precision, creating overlapping fields of observation that would make conventional escape nearly impossible. Devil's Spine loomed ahead of them like a great stone serpent frozen in mid-strike. The ridge was even more intimidating up close than Marcus had imagined. The path along its crest was indeed barely wide enough for a single person, and the drops on either side fell away into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. "The handholds," Takala said, running her fingers along the rock face near the beginning of the ridge. "Here, and here." She pointed to subtle indentations in the stone that would have been invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Marcus examined the carved holds more closely. They were ancient, worn smooth by countless hands, but still solid and reliable. Someone with incredible skill and patience had created these aids to passage, turning an impossible crossing into something merely terrifying.
We go one at a time, Ayana decided.
If one falls, the others might still escape.
I will go first, I am lightest, and if the path cannot hold me, it cannot hold any of us.
Before Marcus could object, the young Apache woman was already moving onto the ridge. She moved with the fluid grace of a dancer, each step carefully placed, each handhold tested before committing her full weight. Watching her, Marcus understood why her grandfather had been able to complete this crossing decades earlier. It required not just courage, but a level of physical skill and mental focus that few people possessed. Takala went next, following her sister's exact path and using the same handholds. The two women seemed to communicate through subtle gestures, Ayana signaling back about loose rocks or particularly challenging sections ahead. When Marcus's turn came, he found the crossing even more difficult than he had expected. His larger frame made the narrow path feel even more precarious, and his boots, designed for horseback riding rather than rock climbing, struggled to find secure purchase on the smooth stone. Several times, loose rocks gave way under his weight, tumbling into the abyss below with sounds that seemed to echo forever. Halfway across, the wind picked up, threatening to tear him from his precarious perch. Marcus pressed himself against the rock face, waiting for the gusts to subside while fighting down waves of vertigo. Below him, the valley floor was lost in shadows so deep they seemed solid. "Do not look down," Ayana called softly from the far side of the ridge. "Look only at the next handhold, the next step. The rock will hold you if you trust it." Her words became a mantra that Marcus repeated with each movement forward. Trust the rock, find the next hold, place each foot with care. Step by step, hold by hold, he made his way across the knife-edge ridge that had claimed so many lives. When he finally reached the far side, Marcus collapsed onto solid ground, his hands shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. The sisters pulled him back from the edge, their own faces showing the strain of their ordeal. "No one will follow us across that," Takala said with grim satisfaction. "Snake Wilson's men are brave enough when facing other people, but few have the courage to face Devil's Spine." They were proven right within the hour. Torchlights appeared at the near end of the ridge as Wilson's search parties finally tracked them to the crossing point. Marcus could hear shouting and angry voices carrying across the valley, but no one attempted to follow their route. The rest of the night passed in steady travel across more conventional terrain. They moved through rolling hills covered with scrub brush and occasional stands of juniper trees, always maintaining careful watch for any signs of pursuit. But it seemed the Devil's Spine had indeed stopped their hunters in their tracks. As dawn broke across the desert, Murphy's trading post came into view. It was a modest collection of buildings surrounded by a low stone wall, with corrals for horses and a well-maintained garden that spoke of careful management. Smoke rose from the main building's chimney, and Marcus could see the proprietor, Sean Murphy, already up and tending to his morning chores. Murphy was a big man with graying red hair and the weathered complexion of someone who had spent his life in harsh climates. When he saw the approaching trio, his hand moved instinctively toward the rifle that leaned against his porch railing, but he relaxed when Ayana called out a greeting in English mixed with a few Apache words. "Ayana. Takala." Murphy's voice carried genuine concern as he took in their bedraggled appearance. "What are you doing so far from the reservation? And who's your friend?" Marcus stepped forward, extending his hand. "Marcus Riley. I ranch south of here. These women were taken by traders, I helped them escape." Murphy's expression darkened as he heard the explanation. "Snake Wilson?" When Marcus nodded, the trader's face grew grim. "That bastard's been getting bolder lately. Federal marshals are looking for him, but he always seems to stay one step ahead. He has many men with him now," Ayana added. "They hunt us still." Murphy ushered them inside his trading post, where the scent of coffee and bacon filled the air. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, with sleeping quarters upstairs and a well-stocked store below. Native American crafts hung alongside manufactured goods from the East, and everything was clean and well-organized. "You'll be safe here," Murphy assured them as he poured coffee into tin mugs. "Wilson knows better than to start trouble at my place. I've got friends in high places, and, more importantly, I've got friends among all the local tribes." He makes a move against me, he'll have more enemies than he can handle. As they sat around Murphy's kitchen table, Marcus felt the tension of the past 2 days finally beginning to ease. They had made it to safety, but he knew their ordeal was far from over. Wilson wouldn't give up easily, and there would be consequences for Marcus's intervention that extended far beyond this immediate crisis.
What happens now? Marcus asked Murphy.
The traitor considered the question carefully. For the girls, I can arrange safe passage back to the reservation. I've got friends among the Apache leaders who'll make sure they're protected.
But, you. He looked at Marcus with concern. Wilson's not going to forget what you did. He'll come after you when he thinks the time is right.
Marcus had already considered this possibility. By interfering with Wilson's operation, he had made himself a target. The man's reputation for revenge was as fearsome as his reputation for cruelty.
Maybe it's time someone stood up to him, Marcus said quietly.
Maybe it's time people realized that what he's doing is wrong, regardless of who his victims are.
Ayanna looked at him with surprise. You would continue to fight? Even knowing the danger?
Marcus met her gaze steadily.
Some things are worth fighting for.
Your freedom, your dignity, the right of all people to be treated as human beings, those things are worth any risk.
Murphy nodded approvingly.
That's good to hear, son. There's been too much looking the other way when Wilson and his kind do their dirty work.
Maybe it is time for good people to make a stand. As the morning wore on, they developed a plan.
Murphy would send word to the Apache reservation about what had happened, ensuring that Ayanna and Takala would have safe escort home. He would also contact the federal marshals, providing them with detailed information about Wilson's operation and his current location. Marcus would remain at the trading post for a few days, both to ensure the women reached safety and to help plan a more comprehensive response to Wilson's activities. It was becoming clear that the traitor's operation was larger and more organized than anyone had realized, and stopping it would require coordination between various law enforcement agencies and tribal authorities. But even as they made their plans, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Wilson wouldn't wait passively for them to organize against him. The man had built his reputation on swift, decisive action, and he had the resources and manpower to strike back quickly. As if responding to his thoughts, Takala suddenly stood and moved to the window that faced south toward the desert. "Riders coming," she said quietly.
"Many riders."
Murphy grabbed his telescope and joined her at the window. After a moment of observation, his face went pale. "Son of a bitch," he muttered. "That's Wilson himself, and he's got at least 20 men with him." Marcus felt his heart sink. They had reached safety, but safety was about to come under attack. Wilson had decided to escalate the conflict, bringing his entire force to bear on Murphy's trading post.
"He won't attack openly," Murphy said, though his voice carried uncertainty. "Too many people know about this place.
Federal authorities would come down on him hard if he started a shooting war here." But, as they watched, Wilson's men began spreading out around the trading post, taking positions that would allow them to control all the approaches. This wasn't a negotiation or a simple intimidation tactic, it was the beginning of a siege. Ayanna moved to Marcus's side, her face set with determination.
"This is because of us," she said.
"We should surrender ourselves. It is not right for others to suffer for our freedom." Marcus shook his head firmly.
"No one is surrendering to that madman. We'll find another way."
Through the window, they could see Wilson himself riding slowly toward the trading post. He was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and the kind of confidence that came from years of intimidating others through violence. When he stopped just outside rifle range, his voice carried clearly across the distance.
"Murphy," Wilson called out. "I know you've got my property in there.
Send out the Apache squaws and whoever helped them escape, and there won't be any trouble." Murphy stepped onto his porch, his own rifle held casually but ready. "The only property you've got any claim to, Wilson, is what you brought with you. These people are under my protection, and they're staying that way."
Wilson's laugh was cold and humorless. "Your protection? Against 20 armed men?" You always were too idealistic for your own good, Murphy. Last chance, send them out, or we'll come in and get them. The standoff had begun, and Marcus realized that their escape had only been the first act of a much larger drama. Now, the question was whether they could survive long enough for help to arrive, and whether they could find a way to end Wilson's reign of terror once and for all. The desert sun climbed higher, beating down on the trading post and the armed men surrounding it. Inside, 4 people prepared to make their stand against overwhelming odds, knowing that the outcome of this confrontation would determine not just their own fates, but the future of anyone who dared to stand up against injustice in this harsh but beautiful land. The tension around Murphy's trading post stretched tight as a bowstring as Wilson's men settled into their positions. Marcus counted at least 20 armed riders spread in a wide circle around the buildings, each positioned to cover potential escape routes. Wilson himself remained mounted in the center of the formation, his presence commanding and intimidating. Inside the trading post, Murphy moved with practiced efficiency, checking his weapons and preparing for what might become a prolonged siege. Got enough food and water for a week, he muttered, more to himself than to the others. Question is whether we'll get the chance to use it. Marcus studied the layout of the buildings through the windows, noting the defensive advantages and weaknesses. The trading post had been built with security in mind, thick stone walls, small windows that could serve as shooting positions, and a clear view of the surrounding terrain. But it had never been designed to withstand a concentrated assault by 20 determined men. Ayana and Takala sat quietly near the back of the main room, speaking in low tones in their native language. Marcus could sense their distress, knowing they blamed themselves for bringing this danger to Murphy and his home. But when he approached them, both women looked up with expressions of determination rather than despair. We have decided, Ayana said quietly. When the sun reaches its highest point, we will walk out together. Surrender ourselves to end this. No, Marcus replied firmly. I told you before, no one surrenders to that madman. We'll find another way. Takala shook her head. You are brave, but this is not your fight to finish. Too many good people will die if we stay hidden. Before Marcus could respond, Wilson's voice boomed across the distance again. I'm getting impatient, Murphy. You've got 1 hour to send out what belongs to me, or we start burning everything you've built here. Murphy appeared in the doorway, his face grim. He means it. Wilson's burned out 6 homesteads over the years, always with some excuse that kept the law off his back. He'll do the same here if he thinks he can get away with it. Marcus felt a cold fury building in his chest. This was exactly the kind of bullying and intimidation that had allowed Wilson to operate with impunity for years. Someone needed to stand up to him, to show him that not everyone could be terrorized into submission. What if we don't wait for him to make the first move? Marcus asked. What if we take the fight to him instead? Murphy looked at him with surprise. 4 against 20? That's not fighting, son, that's suicide. Not if we're smart about it, Marcus replied, his mind racing through possibilities. Wilson's got numbers, but he's also got an ego. Men like him can't resist showing off their power. What if we give him a chance to do exactly that? As he spoke, Marcus moved to the window facing Wilson's position. The outlaw leader was still mounted in the center of his formation, clearly visible and apparently confident in his safety. You thinking of trying for a long shot? Murphy asked, following his gaze. No, Marcus said slowly. I'm thinking about something my father used to say. He told me that the biggest, loudest rooster in the henhouse is usually the one who's most afraid of getting his tail feathers plucked. Ayana joined them at the window, studying Wilson's position with the tactical eye she had inherited from her grandfather. He keeps his men spread out, she observed. But he stays in the center, where he feels safest. If something happened to him, his men might scatter, Marcus finished. Or they might come at us harder than ever. It's a big risk. Murphy stroked his beard thoughtfully. There's another possibility, he said. Wilson's operation isn't just about him. He's got backing from some powerful people who prefer to stay in the shadows. If Wilson disappeared, those people would just find someone else to do their dirty work.
The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses from the north. All four defenders moved to windows facing that direction, fearing that Wilson had brought even more reinforcements. But what they saw instead gave them the first hope they had felt since the siege began. A column of blue-uniformed cavalry was approaching at a steady trot, led by an officer whose bearing spoke of experience and authority. Behind the soldiers rode several Apache warriors in traditional dress, their presence suggesting that word had already reached the reservation about the women's disappearance. "Well, I'll be damned," Murphy breathed. "Looks like help's arrived after all." Wilson had seen the approaching cavalry as well. Marcus watched through the window as the outlaw leader gestured angrily to his men, clearly caught off guard by this development. The carefully planned siege was suddenly becoming a much more complicated situation. The cavalry column stopped just outside rifle range, and the commanding officer rode forward alone under a white flag. Wilson urged his horse out to meet him, though his body language suggested he was far from pleased by this turn of events. "Captain Mitchell," Murphy said, recognizing the officer through his telescope. "Good man. Fair man. He's dealt with Wilson before." The conversation between the two mounted men was too distant to hear, but its nature became clear from their gestures. Captain Mitchell was obviously demanding an explanation for Wilson's presence and actions, while Wilson was just as obviously trying to justify the siege as some kind of legitimate law enforcement operation. After several minutes of heated discussion, both men rode back to their respective forces. Captain Mitchell dismounted and walked toward the trading post, his hands clearly visible and empty. Murphy opened the door to meet him. "Captain. Good to see you." "Wish I could say the same about the circumstances, Sean," Mitchell replied grimly. "Wilson claims you're harboring fugitives who attacked his men and stole valuable property. He wants them turned over for proper legal proceedings." "And what did you tell him?" Murphy asked. "I told him that I'd investigate his claims personally before taking any action," Mitchell said. "Mind if I come in and hear the other side of the story?" Once inside, Marcus and the sisters quickly related the events of the past few days, the initial rescue, their escape through the hidden canyons, and the dangerous crossing of Devil's Spine. Captain Mitchell listened carefully, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated both his military training and his familiarity with the political complexities of the territory. "The two ladies will need to give their testimony officially," Mitchell said when they finished. "But, based on what I'm hearing, this sounds more like kidnapping and attempted slavery than any legitimate trading operation." Ayanna stepped forward, speaking with quiet dignity. "Captain, we are grateful for your protection. But we know that speaking against white men in court can be dangerous for Apache people. We are prepared to take that risk if it will stop this evil." Mitchell nodded respectfully. "I understand your concerns, miss. But you should know that federal law takes human trafficking very seriously, regardless of the races involved. Wilson's been on our watch list for months, we just needed evidence and witnesses." Through the window, they could see Wilson's men growing increasingly agitated. Some were dismounting and checking their weapons, while others seemed to be arguing among themselves. The presence of federal cavalry had clearly disrupted their leaders' plans. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now I go back out there and place Wilson under arrest for federal crimes," Mitchell replied. "The question is whether he'll come quietly or decide to make a fight of it." Murphy laughed grimly. "Snake Wilson never did anything quietly in his life. You can bet he'll fight." As if summoned by their conversation, Wilson's voice rang out across the distance again. "Mitchell! I'm done talking. You've got no jurisdiction here, and I've got business to finish. Take your toy soldiers and ride away while you still can." Mitchell's expression hardened. This was exactly the kind of direct challenge to federal authority that could not go unanswered. "Looks like we're going to do this the hard way," he said. The captain returned to his men and began issuing orders. The cavalry spread out in a formation that mirrored Wilson's, creating two opposing forces with the trading post caught in the middle. The Apache warriors positioned themselves as flankers, ready to cut off any escape routes through terrain that cavalry might have difficulty navigating. Marcus watched the developing confrontation with growing unease. "There's going to be a battle," he said to Murphy. "Right here, with us in the middle of it." "Not if I can help it," Murphy replied, checking his rifle one more time. "Wilson's men are tough, but they're not soldiers. First time bullets start flying, half of them will remember they've got somewhere else to be." But, as the two forces faced each other across the dusty ground, Marcus realized that the situation had grown beyond anyone's ability to control peacefully. Wilson had invested too much in his operation to surrender without a fight, and Captain Mitchell couldn't afford to back down from a direct challenge to federal authority. The standoff stretched for long minutes, tension building like pressure in a steam engine. Then, without warning, one of Wilson's men fired a shot that echoed across the desert like thunder. Whether it was intended as a signal or simply the product of nervous tension, it had the same effect. Both sides erupted in gunfire. The battle for Murphy's trading post had begun. Marcus dropped below window level as bullets began smashing into the stone walls around them. Through the chaos of gunfire, he could hear Captain Mitchell shouting orders to his men and Wilson's voice roaring commands to his scattered forces. "Stay down," Murphy called out as he positioned himself at a window facing Wilson's main group. "Let the cavalry handle this, our job is to keep the women safe." But Ayanna and Takala had not survived their ordeal by remaining passive victims. Both women had found positions where they could observe the battle while staying protected, and Marcus was surprised to see that Ayanna had somehow acquired one of Murphy's spare rifles. "I learned to shoot from my grandfather," she explained when she saw his expression. "He said a person who cannot defend themselves will always be at the mercy of others." The gunfight raged for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Wilson's men had the advantage of prepared positions, but the cavalry had superior training and discipline. Gradually, the volume of fire from the outlaws began to diminish as men fell or decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Through the window, Marcus could see Wilson himself, still mounted and still shouting orders, though his horse danced nervously as bullets whined overhead. The outlaw leader seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to avoid being hit, and his presence was clearly inspiring his men to continue fighting despite their losses. "Someone needs to end this," Marcus muttered, raising his own rifle and taking careful aim. "No," Ayanna said sharply, placing her hand on his weapon. "Look." Following her gaze, Marcus saw movement among the Apache warriors who had accompanied the cavalry. They were working their way around the flanks of Wilson's position, using the rocky terrain and their superior knowledge of the landscape to get close without being detected. One of the warriors, a young man with intricate facial tattoos that marked him as a war leader, had maneuvered to within 50 yards of Wilson's position. The outlaw leader, focused on the cavalry to his front, never saw the Apache warrior rising from behind a boulder with his rifle already aimed. The single shot that ended the battle came not from the cavalry, not from the defenders in the trading post, but from the rifle of an Apache warrior defending his people's honor and safety. Wilson jerked in his saddle, looked around with confusion and shock, and then toppled to the ground. The effect on his men was immediate and dramatic. Without their leader's voice holding them together, Wilson's force began to disintegrate. Some threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, while others spurred their horses and fled across the desert in every direction. Captain Mitchell's voice cut through the sudden quiet. "Cease fire. Cease fire. Surrender will be accepted." Within minutes, the battle was over. Wilson lay motionless in the dust where he had fallen, his reign of terror finally ended. 8 of his men had been killed or wounded, while the rest were either captured or scattered to the winds. Marcus emerged from the trading post with the others, hardly able to believe that their ordeal was finally over. The Apache warrior who had fired the decisive shot approached them, and Marcus was surprised when Ayanna ran forward to embrace him. "My brother, Nailnish," she explained to Marcus. "When word reached the reservation that we had been taken, he organized the warriors to help search for us." Nailnish studied Marcus with dark, intelligent eyes. "My sisters tell me you risked your life to save them," he said in careful English. "This makes you brother to our family, brother to our people." The words carried a weight and significance that Marcus was only beginning to understand. By accepting him as family, the Apache were offering him something precious and rare: acceptance into their community, protection under their customs, and a bond that would last for generations. Captain Mitchell approached the group, his expression mixing relief with professional concern. "We'll need statements from all of you," he told them. "This is going to generate a lot of paperwork, and probably some political complications too." "What kind of complications?" Marcus asked. Wilson had connections to some powerful people in the territorial government, Mitchell explained. People who profited from his operations and made sure he never faced serious consequences. With him dead, they're going to be looking for scapegoats and ways to cover their tracks. Murphy nodded grimly. "Which means it's not over yet." "Wilson's dead, but the system that protected him is still in place." As they spoke, some of Wilson's surviving men were brought forward under guard. One of them, a thin man with shifty eyes, was talking rapidly to the cavalry sergeant, obviously trying to bargain his way out of serious charges. "He's telling them about Wilson's backers," Ayanna observed, reading the man's body language with the same skill she had shown in navigating the desert. "Trying to trade information for his freedom." Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and concern. Justice was being served, but the web of corruption and violence that had enabled Wilson's crimes was larger and more complex than any single battle could resolve. Later that afternoon, as the wounded were tended and the prisoners secured, Marcus found himself sitting with Ayanna and Takala outside the trading post. The sisters were preparing to return to the reservation with their brother and the other Apache warriors, and Marcus realized he might never see them again. "What will you do now?" Ayanna asked him. Marcus considered the question carefully. "Go back to my ranch, I suppose. Try to rebuild what I can. But, after everything we've been through..." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I don't think I can go back to the way things were before." Takala smiled for the first time since he had met her. "Good," she said simply. "The way things were before was not good for anyone." Nelnish approached them, carrying something in his hands. "Before you return to your ranch," he said to Marcus, "there is something you must have." He held out a small pouch made of soft leather and decorated with intricate beadwork. Inside were several small objects, a piece of turquoise, an arrowhead carved from obsidian, and a small bone carved with symbols Marcus didn't recognize. "These are protection medicine," Nelnish explained. "Made by our grandmother, blessed by our medicine man. You carry this, our ancestors watch over you. You are family now, family protects family." Marcus accepted the gift with deep emotion, understanding that he was receiving something far more valuable than mere objects. He was being welcomed into a spiritual and cultural tradition that stretched back countless generations. As the sun began to set over the desert, casting long shadows across the battlefield where Snake Wilson's reign of terror had finally ended, Marcus reflected on how much had changed in just a few days. He had ridden out from his ranch as a struggling rancher facing financial ruin. He was returning as something entirely different, a man who had found his courage, his purpose, and his place in the larger community of people fighting for justice and dignity. The Apache warriors prepared to depart, with Ayanna and Takala mounted on horses provided by Captain Mitchell. Before leaving, both women approached Marcus one final time. "You saved our lives," Ayanna said simply. "But, more than that, you treated us with respect and dignity when many would not. This is a gift we will never forget." Takala nodded agreement, then added with her characteristic directness, "When you need help, you call for us. Apache people remember their debts." As the warriors rode away toward the reservation, Marcus watched until they disappeared into the gathering dusk. Captain Mitchell approached, leading Marcus's horse which had been recovered from the original campsite. "You ready to head home?" the captain asked. Marcus mounted his horse and settled into the familiar saddle, but the man who rode away from Murphy's trading post was not the same one who had arrived there 3 days earlier. He carried with him not just the physical tokens of his new Apache family, but something far more profound, a new understanding of what it meant to be a man of courage and principle in a harsh and often unjust world. The desert stars were beginning to emerge as Marcus pointed his horse toward home, toward whatever challenges and opportunities awaited him there. Behind him, the trading post glowed with lamplight as Murphy and Captain Mitchell continued their discussions about the legal and political ramifications of the day's events. Ahead lay his ranch, his cattle, and the mundane struggles of making a living from unforgiving land. But Marcus knew that his real work was just beginning. Wilson was dead, but the attitudes and systems that had enabled his crimes were still very much alive. Changing those would require the efforts of many people over many years. As he rode through the cool night air, Marcus found himself thinking about the ancient rock paintings he had seen in the sacred chamber, figures of hunters and spirits that had watched over the desert for countless generations. Those painters had faced their own struggles and challenges, their own battles between justice and oppression. Now it was his turn to be part of that ongoing story, to add his own marks to the long record of human struggle and triumph. The cowboy who had thundered his defiance at Snake Wilson was ready to take on whatever came next. 3 months had passed since the battle at Murphy's trading post, and the desert autumn brought cooler nights and the promise of winter rains. Marcus Riley stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch house, watching the sun set over land that looked subtly different than it had before his encounter with Snake Wilson and the Apache sisters. The changes weren't just in the landscape, though the late summer storms had indeed brought more grass than he had seen in years. The real changes were in the relationships and alliances that had grown from those desperate days when courage had mattered more than convenience. His cattle herd had grown substantially, thanks in part to an unexpected partnership with several Apache families who had expertise in finding water sources and grazing areas that Marcus had never known existed. The arrangement was informal but mutually beneficial. His Apache neighbors helped manage his cattle in exchange for a share of the profits and access to veterinary care from the doctor in the nearest town. The legal aftermath of Wilson's death had proven as complicated as Captain Mitchell had predicted. Federal investigations had uncovered a network of corruption that reached into the territorial capital, leading to several arrests and resignations. Marcus had spent weeks giving testimony to various officials, detailing not just the events of that violent confrontation, but the larger pattern of exploitation and abuse that Wilson's operation had represented. The thin man who had tried to bargain for his freedom had indeed provided valuable information, leading authorities to several other human trafficking operations throughout the territory. But he had also tried to implicate Marcus in Wilson's crimes, claiming that the rancher had been a business partner rather than a rescuer. Only the strong testimony of Ayanna, Takala, and Murphy had prevented those false charges from gaining traction. The political repercussions continued to echo through territorial politics. Several prominent businessmen and government officials had been forced to resign when their financial connections to Wilson's operation became public. The scandal had energized reform movements and strengthened the hand of federal authorities trying to establish genuine law and order in the region. Marcus had become something of a reluctant celebrity, his story spread by newspaper correspondents who saw in it a compelling narrative of individual courage triumphing over organized evil. But the attention made him uncomfortable, particularly when some accounts portrayed the Apache sisters as helpless victims rather than the resourceful and courageous women they actually were. On this particular evening, Marcus was expecting visitors. Word had come through Apache messengers that Ayanna and Takala would be arriving with their brother Nailnish and several other tribal representatives. The purpose of their visit was both personal and political. They were traveling to the territorial capital to testify before a congressional committee investigating conditions on the reservations. As the last light faded from the western sky, Marcus heard the sound of approaching horses. A group of riders emerged from the dusk, led by the familiar figure of Nailnish on his paint horse. Behind him rode Ayanna and Takala, both looking more confident and assured than when he had first met them as terrified captives. "Marcus!" Ayanna called out as they approached the ranch house. "It is good to see you again, brother." The word brother still carried emotional weight for Marcus. Over the past months, he had learned more about Apache customs and traditions, and he understood that being accepted as family was both an honor and a responsibility that would last his entire life. The reunion was warm but brief, as the Apache travelers were anxious to share news that had brought them here ahead of their planned testimony in the capital. "There have been more disappearances," Nailnish explained as they gathered in Marcus's living room. "Young women from 3 different reservations, taken from places where they should have been safe. The pattern is the same as Wilson's operation." Marcus felt his blood run cold. "I thought we had ended all that when Wilson died." "We ended Wilson," Takala corrected, her English now much more fluent than during their first meeting. But we did not end the hunger for what Wilson provided. Where there is demand, someone will always try to supply it.
Ayanna added, the new leader calls himself the Baron.
He is more careful than Wilson, harder to track. But our people have seen his men, and we have heard the stories from women who escaped. The news that the human trafficking network had reconstituted itself under new leadership was devastating but not entirely surprising. Wilson's operation had been profitable enough to attract others willing to take the risks involved.
What can we do? Marcus asked.
The federal authorities seemed committed to stopping this kind of thing. Federal authorities are committed when there are newspapers watching and politicians demanding action, Nailnish said with bitter experience.
When attention moves elsewhere, commitment weakens.
Already, some officials speak of accommodation with local customs rather than enforcement of federal law.
Marcus understood the implication.
The initial outrage over Wilson's crimes had created political pressure for strong action, but public attention was already shifting to other issues.
Without continued pressure, enforcement would likely become less vigorous.
The Congressional Committee wants to hear from all of us, Ayanna explained. Not just about what happened with Wilson, but about the larger problems that allowed such operations to flourish.
They want to understand why local authorities consistently failed to protect vulnerable people.
The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another unexpected visitor. Sean Murphy rode up to the ranch house, his face grim with news that clearly complemented what the Apache representatives had already shared.
Figured you'd want to know right away, Murphy said after greeting the others.
Got word from my contacts in Mexico that the Baron's been recruiting new men.
Word is he's planning something big, something that will make Wilson's operation look small-time.
The trading post owner had become an unofficial intelligence coordinator for the various groups trying to combat human trafficking in the region. His network of contacts among traders, travelers, and tribal representatives provided information that was often more timely and accurate than official government sources.
What kind of something big? Marcus asked. Murphy's expression was troubled. Mass roundup, targeting multiple reservations simultaneously.
He's apparently been studying what went wrong with Wilson's operation, and he's concluded that the mistake was thinking too small.
The implications were staggering.
If the Baron was planning coordinated attacks on multiple reservations, he would need significantly more men and resources than Wilson had ever commanded. More troubling was the suggestion that he had learned from Wilson's mistakes, which implied a more sophisticated and dangerous operation.
How long do we have? Nailnish asked.
Best guess is 2 weeks, maybe 3, Murphy replied. Long enough for us to warn people, but not long enough to get federal authorities organized for an effective response. Marcus felt the familiar surge of determination that had driven him to action months earlier.
Then, we don't wait for federal authorities.
We organize our own response.
The others looked at him with expressions ranging from admiration to concern.
Ayanna spoke for all of them when she said, Marcus, what you did before was brave, but this is different.
The Baron has 50 men, maybe more.
And, unlike Wilson, he won't be caught by surprise. Which is exactly why we need to do something unexpected, Marcus replied.
The Baron studied Wilson's defeat, but did he study what made it possible in the first place?
As they discussed possibilities, a plan began to emerge that was audacious in its scope and ambitious in its goals. Rather than simply trying to protect potential victims, they would go on the offensive, targeting the Baron's operation at its source and disrupting his network before he could launch his planned mass roundup. The strategy would require coordination between multiple groups that had never worked together before: Apache warriors, federal cavalry, local ranchers, and even some of the reformed members of Wilson's organization who had been cooperating with authorities. It would also require taking risks that went far beyond anything any of them had contemplated before. Over the following days, Marcus's ranch became an unofficial headquarters for planning the operation against the Baron. Representatives from various tribes arrived daily, bringing intelligence about the new criminal organization and contributing warriors to the planned response. Captain Mitchell arrived with a small detachment of cavalry, operating under orders that were deliberately vague enough to provide official deniability if the operation went wrong. The federal government wanted the Baron stopped, but they also wanted to avoid direct confrontation with the powerful interests that continued to profit from human trafficking. The breakthrough came when one of the reformed members of Wilson's gang provided detailed information about the Baron's base of operations. Located in a box canyon 30 miles south of the Mexican border, the stronghold was fortified and well-supplied, designed to withstand both military assault and siege warfare.
Direct attack is suicide, the informant explained as he sketched the canyon's layout. But there's a weakness.
The Barons got to bring in supplies and fresh men through a narrow pass. Control that pass, and you control everything that goes in or out. Marcus studied the crude map, noting the strategic choke point that could indeed make all the difference.
How many men does he keep at the pass?
Usually 6 or 8, sometimes more when expecting trouble. But here's the thing, they're expecting trouble from federals coming up from Mexico, not from Norteamericanos coming down from the territories. The plan that emerged from this intelligence was complex but achievable. A mixed force of Apache warriors and volunteer ranchers would approach the Baron's stronghold from the north, creating the impression of a standard military operation. Meanwhile, Marcus would lead a smaller team through hidden routes to seize control of the supply pass, cutting off the Baron's escape route and reinforcements. The most dangerous part of the mission would fall to Ayana and Takala, who had volunteered to infiltrate the stronghold by posing as captured victims. Their role would be to identify and protect the women already held prisoner, ensuring that any rescue operation would save rather than endanger the people they were trying to help.
I don't like it, Marcus told Ayana as they finalized the details.
You'll be walking back into the same kind of situation we rescued you from months ago.
Which is exactly why we must do this, Ayana replied firmly.
We know what those women are feeling, what they are fearing. If rescue comes, they need to see familiar faces, people who understand what they have suffered.
Takala added, besides, we are not the same women who were taken by Wilson's men.
We have learned much, grown stronger. This time, we go by choice, with purpose. 3 days before the planned operation, Marcus received an unexpected visitor that complicated everything.
Federal Marshal James Harrison arrived at the ranch with a small escort and official orders that could potentially derail their entire plan.
I'm here to inform you that the United States government has decided to handle the Baron situation through diplomatic channels, Harrison announced.
There will be no unauthorized military action against targets in Mexican territory.
Marcus felt his heart sink. Political pressure from business interests with investments in the region had apparently overcome concerns about human trafficking. The Baron would be free to continue his operations as long as he kept them south of the border.
What about the women he's already taken? Marcus asked. What about the raids he's planning?
Marshal Harrison's expression suggested he shared Marcus's frustration but was bound by his orders. Official policy is that these are matters for Mexican authorities to handle.
Unofficial policy is that important people want this problem to go away quietly.
The Marshal's visit created a crisis for the planned operation. Proceeding without federal support was one thing, but proceeding in direct violation of federal orders was another matter entirely. Anyone caught participating could face serious criminal charges. That evening, as the various group leaders met to discuss their options, Marcus found himself facing the hardest decision of his life. He could abandon the operation and return to the safety of his ranch, knowing that innocent people would suffer but avoiding personal consequences. Or he could proceed with the mission, accepting the risk of federal prosecution for the chance to stop the Baron's planned atrocities.
Whatever we decide, Nailish said during the tense discussion, we decide together. If some face consequences, all face consequences. This is how family works.
One by one, the group leaders voiced their commitment to continuing the mission despite the federal prohibition. The Apache warriors spoke of their obligation to protect their people regardless of political complications. The volunteer ranchers talked about their duty to defend the innocent. Even Captain Mitchell, operating under increasingly ambiguous orders, indicated that his patrol might happen to be in the area when events unfolded. Marcus realized that the decision had already been made, not by any single person but by the collective will of people who had seen too much suffering to turn away now.
They would proceed with the operation, accepting whatever consequences might follow.
2 days later, at dawn on a crisp autumn morning, Marcus led his team south toward the Baron's stronghold and what would become known as the Battle of Sangre Canyon. The force was smaller than originally planned, but it was unified in purpose and strengthened by months of coordination and trust-building between groups that had once been strangers or enemies. As they rode through the desert landscape that had become so familiar to him over the past months, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had begun as a struggling rancher facing financial ruin, become a reluctant hero, and was now leading a multi-ethnic coalition against organized crime. The protective medicine pouch that Nailnish's grandmother had made for him hung around his neck, a constant reminder of the bonds of family and obligation that now governed his choices. Whatever happened in the canyon ahead, Marcus knew he was no longer fighting just for his own survival or even for abstract principles of justice. He was fighting for the sisters who had become his family, for the warriors who had accepted him as a brother, for the women held captive in the Baron's stronghold, and for the future possibility that different peoples could work together to create something better than the violence and exploitation that had marked the region's past. The sun climbed higher as they approached their destiny, its light revealing a landscape that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. Somewhere ahead lay answers to questions that had haunted Marcus since that first day when he had heard the words, "That's enough, they belong to me," and had decided that some things were worth fighting for regardless of the odds against success. The desert would remember what happened next, just as it had remembered countless other struggles between justice and injustice, courage and cowardice, hope and despair. The ancient rock painters had known this truth when they recorded their own stories on canyon walls that still stood thousands of years later. Now it was Marcus's turn to add his own chapter to that eternal story, to prove that ordinary people could rise to extraordinary challenges when the stakes were high enough and the cause was just. The Baron's reign of terror would end today, one way or another. Behind him rode an unlikely army united by shared purpose and mutual respect. Ahead lay whatever destiny awaited those brave enough to stand up for what was right in a world that too often rewarded those willing to compromise with evil. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Marcus Riley, the cowboy, rancher, brother, and defender of the innocent, was ready.